I think I had in mind something that would be probably a little bit more heroic than how it turns out. What I realized as I started looking at some things was that really I was still collecting stuff, and then I was trying to double check some names. There's still one project, and I've completely forgotten who did it, and I've got 2 pictures of it, and I couldn't find it this morning. So I admit that my searches were not entirely successful. But I realized, going through some of the source materials through the books, that there's still loads more. I could probably go prattling on about stuff forever, or certainly for another 3 lectures, which would become increasingly boring probably, and maybe even repetitive. But I realized that one of the things that intrigues me, and so the title panel was done before I'd even collected the pictures. It might be rhetorical in the sense that I think that there are architects around who are very well aware of the powerfulness of the materiality and play with the presence of the object. And I think that's what today is probably about. It's not only to do with the material and the substance and the stuff itself, but it's the way in which certain architects who would have had at their disposal many different ways of doing things have sort of twisted it or tuned it or manipulated to attend you with a particular set of objects or substances. Let's see if that works. We go around the world. Could I have the lights off, actually? The lights off might flatter the slightly more crappy slides that I've got. Or confirm the fact they're out of focus. I don't think so. Anyway, this is I think it was in Madrid, but it might well have been somewhere else. But I think it was in Madrid I took this. Sometimes you just see a sort of funny shop like that, and you say, oh, wow, there's a load of stuff in there. And then maybe when you get close to you find it's what you could buy, what you used to be able to buy in the Tottenham Court Road, and probably now can buy in the Bulls Pond Road. But sometimes it's presented like that you feel that whoever is selling those electrical goods is a bit of an enthusiast, and there is always a special sort of extra kind of come on that it has if it's in a place that you're not in if it was down the street. You know, we work out of Clerkenwell, and I live near Swiss Cottage, and if it was round the corner there, you'd say, yeah, that shop's got a lot of electrical stuff in the window, and you'd sort of glaze over unless you wanted to go and buy a fuse or something. But because it's in a foreign town and you're looking for exotica subconsciously, and I thought it was good to start on something that in no way is sort of claiming to have any architectural statement, except that it might well be playing the same game. He's selling lamps and bits of alarm clocks, they look like, or something. God knows what they are in this particular picture. And I think I sense that there's an enthusiasm and a sort of a little bit of neatness thrown in there, you know, that such a shop could be very higgledy-piggledy. And I got another example, just happened to be walking down a street in Copenhagen the other day, and I thought that, of course it's not particularly Danish, it could be in any of a number of cities, but it's definitely stuff. Somebody's stuck all this stuff out there, and it's got that sort of Camden Lock overtone in a kind of neat Danish way. But I think that is an aspect of saying, here's all the stuff, come and get it, come and buy it, and then on second look you might find a label which gives you the price or says where it comes from. But it's meant to attend your eye by, not that any of the components are particularly fantastic. In fact, I think they're particularly not fantastic. But it attends your eye by its conglomeration. And I think architecture sometimes can do that, or choose not to. And we were in Helsinki the other day, and it was very cold, and there had been a lot of snow. And this is definitely stuff. In fact, you could doctor the photograph, cutting out the BMW disc, and you'd have to wonder what the hell it was. You know, was it a piece of sort of sugar icing that had gone wrong, or a dead polar bear, or what? No, it is, of course, as you can see, a car that has been left there for some days. And it's stuff. The stuff in this case is not the car. The stuff is the snow covering. And that raises immediately a whole notion that the car is there, and should anybody dig through and open the door and clear the windscreen, they could presumably drive off, and it returns to being a car, and then it would gradually shed the stuff. But here it's just something. It's just a lump of stuff. And it's also probably as nice an object as you could do with a complicated parametric operation without bothering. Just let God snow on you, and there you go. So I thought that was... Or you have really architectural stuff. Here we are in Istanbul. Don't ask me who did it, but my God, it's fruity. And it was obviously, even on a wet day, was fruity when I photographed it. And somebody there is keen to impress. What is also, I suppose, secondarily interesting is that the somebody who was keen to impress for the king or caliph or whoever the hell was behind there originally, somebody important because he still has troops standing outside. I guess it's the president or something. Anyway, no, it's not the capital, is it? So it can't be. Anyhow, I digress. What interests me is that, of course, there's an enormous amount of stuff at the skyline. As we reach the sort of leftovers of classical courses, tablatures and so on, it's still pretty fruity, but starts to get itself organized. But as we go further down towards the ground, it almost gets standard. It almost could be in Bedford Square. It's, you know, normal columns on normal bases, finally, so that the degree of stuff is adjusted according to how near the sky you are. And this is not the only example of that, but it's a good one. And I find that fascinating, that you would show your wealth or dexterity on the skyline, and then gradually as things got closer, and probably you didn't want to get them messed up by somebody picking at them, you simplified it so that roughly up to a bit beyond the height of a person, it's sort of business as usual. It only gets fruity where they can't touch it, but where they can see it. Maybe that's quite a sensible thing. Now we skip to something completely different. This is in what used to be called the Mozambique, and it's by Pancho Gonzales, who I showed you, I think, last time. And it's actually a piece of built Pancho Gonzales stuff, still there after probably 40 years or more. Still in pretty good condition, and whether they're painted it up or not, or it was very well painted when they did it. But it's interesting because I think, and this came up in a sort of crit conversation the other day, that Geddes understands just about how much you need to do in a place that doesn't have the world's most sophisticated building technology, where he had already by that time, I think, trained up a team of people who could do his sort of stuff. And the detailing is, it's crude, but it's not that crude. I mean, it works very well. And I think that's something, it's the complete opposite, really, of what we've just seen, in the sense that it has its limits, but my God, it works emblemically, or I suppose to use the current term, as a piece of iconography. And I have a great admiration for that. And actually, if you start looking at it, you realize that his little team weren't too bad because they managed to manipulate the concrete to curve fairly in a controlled way. It's actually more sophisticated the more you start looking at it. And the pursuit of stuff is something which I think has continued at the Bartlett more than it has in this school. I hope you'll excuse me for showing a couple of Bartlett projects, because I think they are highly stuffist. This, in fact, was a lady who was a very successful student and is in great demand by offices in London, and probably will never do anything like this again. But what I like about it is its originality, and at the same time, its ability to be controlled within a predictable space. So in a sense, it's playing the same game as the Turkish gateway, in the sense that you set up a discipline, a container, and then you decide how much the thing can kind of proliferate within that situation. Well, this could be here. It's not actually. It's from SciArc in Los Angeles. But it is a roof that is used in the main lecture hall. And so there I think that they have, and it is sort of digitally infected fabric. And it hangs, it's done by an Italian lady whose name has slipped my mind, but she teaches at SciArc. And it's very agreeable because it's there, and it actually it's there every time you give a lecture. And it deals with the acoustics, and at the same time has a sort of sweetness about it. It's sort of soft, and it does flop if there was a heavy wind. And then round the corner in the corridor, still in SciArc, there's one of the structures that they have developed, and you guys in the school, I know, do similar things to this. This is done in a program they have where they work together with the Los Angeles office of Bureau Hapo. And then a building which I'm sure many of you are aware of, the Herzog and de Meuron sports building near Stuttgart, the stadium, where perhaps the sort of investigations of the previous slide can then apply themselves, that sooner or later, with all that kind of stuff, you have to skin it. You have to make it so that the wind doesn't blow through and the rain doesn't come in. And that in this particular case, being rather good architects, they know just about how much control to put on the system without making it boring. It's on that sort of borderline between being corny and boring and actually being, what other word can I use but attractive? I'm sure that the billowing has some structural drivers, but not necessarily as much as it billows there. In other words, the calculation of how much to make it billow, how often to make the intersections, how pink to make the pink, is all tunable. It could be pinker, would still work. It could billow less, it would still work. It could certainly billow more and still work. And the dimensions probably could be varied up to maybe 50 or more percent, and it would still work. So immediately then, even though at the time that this was done, it was, something that people crossed the street to look at, it was relatively avant-garde. But in fact, it falls within the very normal, traditional rules of discrimination within parameters which allow you quite a wide margin of discrimination. And I find that interesting, that you have to often, with a building, look past the mannerism and say, what were the possibilities with this? And did it do it well or badly or thoughtfully? So here's a typical stuffist situation. This is my friend Mark Smout, who teaches at the Bartlett. with Massimiliano Fuxas, who's never averse to popping around architecture schools buying talent. He's very good at it. I've seen him certainly up the road. He probably does it here with a notebook, writing down names of people who may or may not receive a phone call. Probably he was a bit bewildered. He's looking a bit miserable there. He's probably a bit bewildered by this lot of stuff, thinking, God, I don't know that I can employ any of these. Actually, it's mostly the work of one person. That's probably two people. And Mark is doing his sort of sales pitch. And Fuxas is sort of wondering. Hasn't actually got his book out of his pocket at this moment in time. But on the other hand, if you look at the progress of the Fuxas office, you can see that he has actually assiduously bought talent, certainly if you compare it with the work that he himself would have done 20 years ago. Something's been going on in that office, and I have, having known many people who've gone there and worked there, it is that he's probably thinking, we ought to do some of this sort of stuff. How will we do it? And can we do it cheaply enough? I don't know, I'm inventing. This is the work of Mark West, who I'm not sure whether he's down to give a lecture here. I think he might be. And is a Canadian, was an American who works in Canada and researches into concrete structures. Also does very, very brilliant and naughty drawings, of which this is one. You have to hold this in your head as, let's say, the extreme point, imaginative point at which Mark West might wish to go. And then see that when it gets into large-scale structures, it doesn't go quite as far, but it goes a hell of a sight further than most precast concrete beams normally do. And then when he does various investigations, which some of them have sort of slightly erotic overtones, but it's all to do with concrete, it's all to do with holding and wrapping and casting concrete. We're into a very interesting territory, because I think one should see those three sets of illustrations together. That's the extent of his imagination. That's almost your bog standard Mark West structure. And these are somewhere in between the two. These, in a sense, make the first drawing possibly possible and bridge towards the middle. And I think that is a kind of work in the sort of creative stuffist world that is well worth following. And I wish to hell there were more people doing that kind of thing. I don't mean specifically doing concrete beams that do that, but the fact that somebody can be both a creative artist, an experimenter, a technologist, and a builder within the same set of references. And that's where stuff and imaginative design come together. The late Jan Capletsky's building in Birmingham is usually shown from the outside. I was interested from this point of view, looking at the inside, where he takes very commonplace conditions such as escalators and the edge of a shopping floor, and by a degree of making them slightly bovine, but at the same time very beautiful, I think, you become very aware of the commonality of the stuff, of what is presumably concrete. It might have a certain amount of plaster in it. I haven't sort of been back to check. They're plaster panels, are they? Ah, there speaks somebody who actually knows. But what's interesting, if they are panels, then they're extremely well massaged to give a homogeneity. And it is as if it's a sort of abstracted stuff, and it has, I think, tremendous power. A guy that you don't hear much about, because he was in the shadow of his then partner. Gropius was the partner. And this guy was called Adolphe Meyer. It's very confusing because there's several Meyers around, of which he's the least known. But my God, he was good at stuff. He was fantastically good at concrete structures. I think many of them got destroyed in the Second World War, but he had contracts with the Frankfurt City railways or the electricity company. He did some industrial stuff which was, I think, extraordinary. And to just take concrete and then manipulate it, both as functional objects and pieces of immense artistic power. I think this is rather special, and I think that you can probably get a lot of hints of how to manipulate if you rummage around the back ends of railways and the back ends of power stations. I've often felt that even if you go around the sort of back end of funny old things like, you know, the Odeon Camden Town, or somewhere up the Bulls Pond Road again, or the back of, you know, the St Pancras, you find structures where the elite public was not watching, but where some really good engineer, designer, architect, maker of things was working to first principles, but not being nervous about it. And the Adolphe Meyer stuff in Frankfurt, I think there's very little of it left, but he's somebody I would like to use out. And still in this chunk stuff, still in the world of concrete, we're back to Pancho Gonzales again. There is the building, which has those yellow pieces. We see now as a total composition, rather fuzzy slide, but we see that it's in fact a very straightforward apartment block with the elements of the apartment block expressed as simple chunks, controlled chunks, and in a way relatively timeless. It's dated, but not to that extent. We're more familiar, of course, by of seeing concrete techniques and their sculptural implications in better known buildings. This is Kahn Salk Institute, or a piece of it. And there we, of course, go to the building knowing that it's by Louie Cohn, expecting it to be special, expecting it to be exquisite and a wonderful place, and it is. My message between these two slides is that to learn about stuff, again, yes, it's great if you go to San Diego, see the Salk Institute, go to see a building done by somebody that you ought to take seriously. But you can learn a hell of a lot, as I say, by just sort of messing around the back of St Pancras or the back of, you know, I don't know, Wandsworth Gasworks, if there's such a place. Or we look at how Zaha's office deals with bringing concrete stuff down to the ground. And it is presented as part of a language where I don't think, I mean, I think her work since this has probably become more and more involved in mass concrete. This was probably the beginning, but it's interesting to see that she too, or her people, are interested in how you play with basic concrete form. Well, interesting thing that moves on then is to consider such form in relation to day and night. Cincinnati by day and the same corner of Cincinnati by night, so that certain of the masses reverse role by depending on how you light them. The piece with the rectilinear blocks becomes just a big black sludge at night. But, of course, the interior of the building emerges through, and that is a pressure which, I think we'll see one or two other examples of that, where in discussing stuff, in discussing the presence of the object, we have to say, yes, but it depends when you see it. If you see it when the sun has moved around to that side of the building, when you see it at night, when you see it at night, if somebody has consciously manipulated it, when they have turned the lights on in the foyer when they turned the lights off in the foyer but still left the lights on, washing the wall, or whatever, or whatever, or whatever, whatever. And I think there's certainly, to slightly digress from these pictures, but train of thought, is that I think that the architects of certain of the northern countries, and I might have mentioned this last time, were very aware of having to design for grey days. And grey days are not flattering of certain architecture. Grey days are difficult to manipulate, and it affects the degree of detail, the degree of profile, etc. Or you just go for it. Now, I don't know the name of the architect here, but we are in Valparaiso, Chile. It's part of the open city, and it's definitely over the top. But it shows what you can do if nobody's sitting on your hand. Presumably the local planners were given a couple of crates of wine or whatever you had to do to keep them off your back. Or perhaps because it's on private land and it doesn't have to have health and safety regulations. I don't know, but anyhow, they did it, and there it is, and it breaks every rule in the book, and probably is either done by maybe a group of people or done by somebody who got bored by one side of it and decided to do it differently around the other side. Yeah. But do you know whether it was done by one person or was it a class? By a group? Mm-hmm. Open city, yeah. Yeah. Well, I would like to know more about this particular one. I just took it out of the book, but I'd never been there, though it does fascinate. And in fact, just to make a link between people in the lecture, Mark West himself has actually been there for some length of time. And somehow is on the same circuit as the guys that now run that school. There's what I call a weird shit international network, which I've threatened, if only I could find somebody to sponsor it, to do an international weird shit conference where you would bring all these people together and upset everybody as a result, which would be great. Well, here's sort of weird shit, but the guys have moved on. This is about 17 years ago, 18 years ago, Karl Pimmelblau, working in, of all places, in the Netherlands, at Groningen. It's their part of the Groningen Museum. And it's a metal building, and it was actually put together by shipbuilders. It's a metal building where they weren't just content to make the tumbling, highly deconstruct forms, but also at the same time were intrigued to experiment with surfaces and patterns and textures and frills that could be dealt with in steel. And I think I may have showed this to you before. At the time when we visited it, my son was only 3 years old and was very noisy. And I have video, which I may have mentioned this before, that is of him running around in the building. And what you hear is the clanking, the clatter of this child wandering around all this metal. And I think that I can't look at this building now without, in my mind's eye, hearing the walking, because it is very much of the atmosphere of the building. It is not like going in a concrete and brick building. It does clatter. Even the quietest person, when you put your hand down or when you move your foot, there's a different resonance of sound. That raises a whole question about sound of stuff. So we're already moving beyond what what you see is what you get, because it depends on the time of day, depends on the temperature, depends where the sun is, but it may also depend upon the resonance of it. This is being an extreme case. Or you hold back, and this is Leverance's church in Klippan, which is in the south of Sweden. A smallish brick building with slightly strange features, but not that strange that you would sort of gulp. That then reveals itself, and it's a wonderful essay what you can do in what I find a rather depressing colour of brick. He seemed to like that brick because he also used the same brick in a church in Stockholm, but I find it slightly depressing until you get inside and you realise that actually it is a highly sculpted building. Not only is the ceiling sculpted, but the floor slightly undulates, and as you walk you realise you're walking on a kind of landscape, and that the light is extraordinarily controlled, and there are parts of the building where light is brought down small shafts. Now I'm moving off stuff into manipulation here. I'm in dangerous territory because I'm moving off my subject. Or I'm saying that you can take what I regard as fairly ordinary material, a limited palette of material, some corten, some bricks as floor, and then manipulate it, which is of course what architects do. This is the one that I can't find who did it, but maybe there's a useful person sitting in the audience who will immediately say, that's by so-and-so. But it shows that we're moving from the mono-material brick to the mono-material timber with just a little bit of manipulation, and then something quite bold. You can get a hell of a lot out of a material that has become, I think, tedious by being used mainly by the timid. I'm going to be arrogant enough to say I think that many architects who use timber planking are the sort of people who would wear a tweed jacket and hope that they melt into the countryside. I'm not very sympathetic to such people, must be admitted. But of course, when we show the whole building, this is no shrinking violet character, even though I can't remember who it is. I think it's Nordic, but I can't. I've lost the reference. But it is amazing that then not only do you fold it out, and then you begin to slat it, and then you begin to use the same material as a reflector, and suddenly this same material is being played in a number of ways together. And that is a piece of expertise, I think. Or we go further. We go to Herb Green in Norman, Oklahoma, chicken shack house, which is less easy to repeat. Very spooky. Out in a sort of open field. Interesting to see that the interior sustains the myth of the chicken shack house. Herb Green was a colleague of Bruce Goff, and they sort of I'm not sure exactly how, but I think they link through to Frank Lloyd Wright in a loose kind of way. I think certainly Goff worked for Wright at some point, and there is this sort of Oklahoma drifting aesthetic that somehow then friends of those seem to head over into Arizona and California. You can pick up on this kind of, but the chicken shack house is still a heroic one because it plays very heavily with the iconography. It's very knowing in how to make it just almost have that animal overtone, have that creepy, sinister overtone, which then, if we buzz back to this one, we're back into the land of the very normal. You could almost face the, Northamptonshire Education Committee with something like this. If you showed them that one first, I think that might be a very good technique. Actually, if you want to do something a bit good, you show them the absolute, and then you say, well, actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm only going to do this, and they. Either that or they think you're a total loony. This, again, I've forgotten the name of the guy, and curiously, it's from Sweden. Very odd that. It's from Sweden, but somebody obviously doing something a long way away from where people were going to check on the fire retardant qualities or the health and safety, or, there's probably some dodgy dodgy, leaking joints. But it's amazing. He or she, whoever it is, had probably seen the chicken shack house or knew of it and found a piece of Sweden where, as I would suspect, nobody was looking much. And that's the sort of thing that I haven't been to this, but the sort of thing that is worth sometimes pursuing. I'm saying, yes, you can go to the back of St Pancras, go to Wallsmont Road, and find stuff that will be useful to you. But if you really want to get a high and points of no return, then you probably do have to go to Mark West's collection of drawings. You do have to go to some funny place in the nowheresville of Sweden. You probably do have to go out to Oklahoma and see some of this stuff just to know how far one might go before almost inevitably it will retreat. Or you admire the mandate of an Aalto to play with brick and to play it fascinatingly. And curiously, it's very difficult. You know, I've seen people try to imitate this kind of thing. They nearly always fall flat on their face because they either, I don't know, it is again a question of discrimination. The basic components are very simple. The basic condition is very simple. But the tailoring, it's really tailoring. So that stuff is related to tailoring. And I'm sure if I was a lecturer on the subject of, you know, suit making and cloth making, I'd probably have an identical set of phrases. I would say, you know, to be certain things you can do if the material is that good, and therefore the stitching is this. Then you can do a cup, or I'm losing myself here slightly. Or we get modest buildings that have a very particular tailoring. And we're into Fujimori again, and I will have a bit more Fujimori in a moment. But I think this is a nice one to have in the row of the sort of monomaterial set. I assume it's some kind of beaten copper type material. And it is quaint, it is strange. I think it would look strange on whatever patterning it were done. The house then doesn't have to do that much more. It is quirky in its form, but not the quirkiest thing that I'm showing you. But the combination, you know, whether we expect a sort of weird goblin to be living inside it or some kind of Japanese crone, I'm not quite sure. But Fujimori is very interesting I think he's an extremely sophisticated person, extremely knowing, extremely well aware of mannerisms, not only Japanese mannerisms, but European mannerisms. And he does not do something like that just by sort of sitting down thinking that's a funny shape. It's very, very considered, in my view, having that regard. Or we have an office like Ben van Burkle's Burkle Studio, which wants to do a fairly straightforward building but make you remember it by simply using quite cute detailing and interesting colours. What a simple idea. Take an ordinary that special going on, but it's coloured and it's quite cutely detailed, and suddenly it's really rather good. It's really, in fact, really very good. Because the other people who do that are Saarbrook and Hutton, who I couldn't get the picture onto the screen, so we're making do with Ben van Burkle. But it's I think that he has fantastically good eye. He was a student here. I remember his student projects when he was a Zaha student, and he always had fantastically good eye. In fact, he started off as an interior designer. I mention that because then all you have to do is to hire people who are very good at detailing and you're in business. Just a sort of hint. And the picture I'd been looking for in the last two lectures and couldn't find, but finally found it, and it seems to fit in well here. This again, we're back in the Hearst headquarters in Frankfurt of Peter Behrens, the one that I showed you the drawings of, and I showed you the black and white photograph of, and the fact that it's simply bricks. Simply bricks. It's what you do with them. You colour them, you modulate them, you sculpt them, and then it becomes size. But it's just basically brick. It's a mono-material condition, highly considered and sculpted. Or to jump straight, whilst we're on the colour conversation, to Mariahs' marketplace, EMBT's marketplace, and the fact that there the sculpting is with the brilliance that Mariahs had at his fingertips, plus taking a selected piece of Catalan tradition and using it on the drapes. But it's also a question of being willing to do it at that scale. You could imagine if it had been done at a tighter scale, a smaller scale, it might have lost it. It might have just looked sort of meretricious. But it has the scale at which you choose to do these things is also an issue. So that in a sense, though I'm trying to keep talking about stuff, at this point, towards the end of the three, I'm really getting back to some of the fundamentals of architecture, which is a question of discrimination, editing, rhetoric in the sense of deciding how much you will give away, how much you will load, how much you will permit a surface to say or hold. Mariahs still in Utrecht. In last year's series, I think I used some of the drawings that he did, his office did, for this building, because I find them absolutely fascinating. It was a question of knitting into a pre-existent town hall. And the complexity and the degree of subtlety of knitting, just as in terms of plan organization, is of a very high order. Then he does some weird stuff with the elevations here. Not very typically Mariahs, actually, but very self-conscious, almost reaching into the territory of Carlo Scarpa. And I find that intriguing. I think that, remembering Henry very well, he was extremely architecturally literate. He had the most amazing collection of books and references, and he knew the stuff. He could look out the bus window and say, I think that's by so-and-so, or that's influenced by so-and-so, and so he was loaded with literacy of reference. And inside the building, we get something even more strange, because then it's prepared to start curving and using panel materials. It's not just a question of solids and applique. It's also using bent panel conditions. It sort of wasn't afraid to use almost anything. That therefore, in a curious way, makes, say, this piece of interior of the Scottish Parliament almost safe. Not really safe. It's full of things going on, but it's actually in a certain way, material-wise and language-wise, it's more controlled than Utrecht, which is way out there trying a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of something else. God knows what will happen next. Here, there's a lot going on, but it's a lot of going on within 3 or 4 sets of condition. It's a Seigawa. Again, has lots and lots of bits going on. This is a nighttime shot, and I think it's intriguing because it says, in this piece of the building, we expose that we have many parts to make up the whole. There's a certain amount of gadgetry involved in holding up the roof, and there are stairs and ramps and pieces of metal and pieces of glass doing this and this and this, although in a glass sheath. But intriguing thing about the photograph is that there's also a piece of architecture coming right up to your foot. There is the suppressed piece of architecture under here with these roof lights. which at night chooses to be almost not there. It is there because you see the roof lights, but it's saying, I've discriminated in the building between that which will chatter and that which will be hidden. Therefore, it's all architected stuff, but one part of the stuff has decided to be chattering, and the other part of the stuff has decided to be silent. Whereas most of us, when we're doing a project of that size, would be doing a certain degree of chatter, if that was our will. Equally, it would chatter and continue chattering, or it would be a quiet building and continue to be quiet. But again, somebody like Seigawa, who on form is very sure of herself, is able to be that extreme with the same building. In the case of Rem's Seattle Library, what I want to draw attention to is the fact that we are bewitched if we are by the sheathing. The sheathing, the actual folded exterior, is clever and brilliant, and yet under certain conditions the other architecture will be exposed, so that you could have here, if you're a very good architect, you can make one set of statements which is to do with almost the virtuoso quality of it as a shape and as a technology of dealing with that shape. That is to say, the cladding, the lacework. And then, you see, once you've got that, under certain lighting conditions, we will reveal to you that the inside is doing something of another level of heroism. Again, it's this thing that you can choose or not to do with different times of day. Or you do it by revelation, how much you let to be seen from the inside to the outside, how much you shock when you enter the building. And of course, in that respect, I think the old cathedrals were very clever, where one of their pet devices, certainly in some English cathedrals, was to take you in through a very small porch, relatively small porch, entry door. And then the actual door into the cathedral is even smaller. And then, BOW! You're in this extraordinary space. It's theatre. And materiality and theatre go hand in hand. Now, there are lots of buildings I could have taken this for. I'm intrigued that in fairly recent years there's been a great preponderance for sort of conscious draping. This is a good example. I think it's quite a nice example. It's not sort of going to make me palpitate, but it's sensible. Hickinen and Mekkonen, the Finnish architects, it's the Finnish embassy in Washington. And it takes a fairly straightforward proposition of building and then makes a very elegant, considered drape. And in fact, for those of us who've been around long enough, there's probably now about a 50-year or more history of this. If you have a taste for it, you go to Germany and you find that Egon Eiermann, who was a very prominent architect in the 50s in Karlsruhe and elsewhere, was able to do it. And then a whole, right up through Herzog and de Meuron. And it is still one of the preferred mannerisms to take a kind of blockhouse and then to say we will put a decoy drape which will be useful in this way and that way and this way and that way, maybe to do with environmental control, whatever, and drape the one in front of the other. Or you make the drape more based upon mannerism. Here, I think the two pieces of the Federation Square in Melbourne are quite amusing to see. One is the solid building and one is the translucent building. Well, by choosing to use the same post-Libeskind mannerisms, it covers all eventualities. It gets a bit sort of crazy at the bottom. It sort of says, wait a minute, we better do something a bit special as we we land and exposes a different scale of itself. If you just take the main part, the same pattern applies to whether it's translucent, transparent, solid, or heavy solid. And actually, although it's a building of which I've heard more bitchy comments than almost any other, I think it's actually rather successful. I have to admit that even in the days when Don Bates, one of the architects, and I, both teaching in this place, would have battles over students, I go there and quite admire what he pulled off. Or we have early or middle period Herzog and de Meuron, where they were cute enough to know just how much to titillate you on a surface. This building could have almost any surface. They chose to give you a titillating surface because they're clever. They sort of switched on like a switch. Almost one feels like saying, what architecture do you want? What picture do you want today? Yes, you can have. Or we have the building you saw the other day in San Sebastian by Mineo. I'm not a great Mineo fan generally, but everybody tells me this is a good building, and I put it in because again it's a sophisticated use of the skinning of this skinned drape. It doesn't play photographic games. It doesn't play three-dimensional games. It doesn't play a lot of translucency, transparency games, but it's very knowing in terms of just how much it allows the surface to tell you and remind you that there's something behind the surface. This business of calculating how much you will give away of the stuff, I find an intriguing conversation. Or you play amusing games with that, like Shigeru Ban, with the curtain house. The drapes are there, or they're not there. And I was talking to somebody yesterday about it who'd been to see it and said, well, actually, there's sliding windows that come out. I said, what do they do? What do they do when they want to go to bed or it's hot, getting a bit cold? So they actually slide the windows out. So it's a gesture, but it's a damn clever gesture, and it reduces, it's making a sort of naughty statement about the stuff of architecture. You don't need anything, just have a curtain. Or you don't have anything at all. Or you have the secret glass that you put up when you're not taking the photograph. And it's all phony, but it's great. You know? And it reminds me of my favorite building that I always drag in. My inspiration at the age of 15 was this Paradise Restaurant by Gunnar Asplund in the Stockholm exhibition of 1930, where again he would have, I'm sure, enjoyed Shigeru Ban's one. The draped curtains. The curtains make, if you strip away the curtains, apart from having quite a cute roof, it's a fairly straightforward building. But it has got the curtains, hasn't it? You can't say that. Similarly, the Paradise Restaurant, if you stripped away the blinds, it's a slab block with a curb on the corner. Well, we've seen that elsewhere. But it isn't that, because it's got the blinds, hasn't it? And that intrigues me, that just the device of the most flimsy element, highly considered in both cases by extremely thinking architects, extremely sophisticated architects of totally different generations. It matters tremendously. It assumes that the base building is held back enough to carry it, I think. Or we have Glen Mercker, who's also a pretty cute old bugger, who just takes he's actually a Mesian. This is the real giveaway about Mercker. You know, he does all that stuff for the roofs usually, but he split it down. It's a Mesian architect. In this case, a Mesian architect who then says, which of course I've done once in another building, and I rather appreciate that. If you take the predictable situation and then just simply evacuate one condition. You don't need more. I'm moving all the time away from stuff, but returning to it now in Helsinki again, where I was the other day since you saw me last. I've been in Helsinki in the cold. And this is a great architect with a wonderful name called Lars Funk. And he was around, I guess, at the beginning of the 20th century. He's a Jugendstil sort of architect. And my God, he enjoys his solid stonework. No messing about there, guys. Wow, great cubes, great plonks of stone. And some of them are pink and some are not pink. And the modeling, there are architectural features, obviously, but they're sparse with themselves. It's an extraordinary presence, this, and it was -15 when I took the slide. And my wife was not encouraging me to stay there too long, taking too many slides, so the bottom got knocked off. But around the corner, we were waved in the direction of this building. I can't remember the name of the guy, but he was Alvar Aalto's teacher, and they serve very good herring in the basement, if you're ever there. But here we are, still in Helsinki, with stuff used to maximum dramatic effect. Sort of recalling the conversation around the Istanbul example. Not completely so, because if you take the height of the man already, or that lady in the fur coat, she could turn her head and become face to face with that guy with the big nose, which I think would be hilarious. I ought to have got somebody. Again, it was about -12. It got warmer. It had gone down to -12 at that point, so I hung around that doorway a little bit longer. And it's a wonderful doorway, and it's in a building, again, with this extraordinary Finnish use of bulk stone, and it's a downtown building. It's sort of downtown shopping street, so it's not sort of out on a windswept hill or anything. It's downtown. And to think that it's all really one material, apart from the door, obviously, makes you think about what we are, how timid we are now with our materials. We say, oh, I'm using tile. It's like, oh, don't think you can do that. We need to do another flat panel again. I find that very irritating. Or you intercept. This is actually Egon Eiermann replenishing a war-destroyed building. Many of you probably know this, in the center of what used to be West Berlin. It's near the zoo station, and it's this church that was almost destroyed, and then Eiermann came around and in a sort of mid-20th century way patched it with deliberate patches. Somehow now, when we see it in the hindsight of time, it becomes more and more homogeneous. I think when I first saw it, I was sort of shocked, but that was a very long time ago. Now it almost reads as one, and you read the sort of 1950s bit almost as if it's the, I don't know what date it would be, but 1850s bit or whatever. Possibly because it's still monochrome, because the trick is that when you get inside, there's a lot of purple stained glass. But from the street, it maintains this monochrome quality. A badly taken picture on my brief visit to Dubai about a year or two back, suggesting that I have very little faith in the sort of architecture that you get in places like this, as to what they can do with stuff other than make it into shapes. Mostly shapes that I don't personally like, but even if I did like them, extreme lack of imagination and willingness to try in terms of the stuff. It's either concrete stuff or glass stuff, or a version of concrete stuff, or a version of glass stuff. And nothing much is done with it. You know, if it's sort of very, very high, it just goes on, and if it's not so high, it doesn't go on as far. I find that the blandness of the interpretation, extremely irritating. I thought I had to stick that in just to say this is a place where they haven't begun to understand stuff. Maybe they don't want to. Now they haven't got the money to do it anyway. And then we're back to Fujimori, who of course we often talk about, and he's going to come to London. He's going to be doing something in the Victoria and Albert, I think in the summer, and is a super guy. Anyway, we normally talk about the absurdity of his composition. I want to come in to talk about the stuff aspects of it. Sorry about the slide, but he, you know, in Japan and in Norway and elsewhere, there is, of course, a tradition of grass roofs. Not so much a tradition of grass in the joints between the material of the wall, but he's a great trier as Fujimori. And he will climb the grass up as a sort of striated system and then have this sort of mysterious hut at the top. Or he will plant it very carefully. I did go to see him in his house on the day when I think the weather hadn't been too good, and actually most of the little trees had died. But that's being naughty and giving the game away. I think you should get 9.5 out of 10 for trying. And if you need to use sort of some sort of chemical to help the plants along, then why not? And I find this very, I mean, I'm going to use terrible English put-down word sweet, but it is sweet. And I think, again, you know, he's an immense trier. And he is very, very sophisticated. He knows his references. He was, as I said to you the last time, he was a fully fledged and quite experienced professor of architectural history and had been teaching for many years before he started to get clients. And he has had several trips to Europe and has seen lots of stuff. This sort of architecture doesn't just come by him sort of thinking that might be a good idea. It's actually very, very, very considered. And he plays with glass, he plays with the sort of spooky, sort of Alice in Wonderland sort of glass situations, which have a resonance to England, have a resonance to the sort of copper kettle coffee shop in a small English town. You could imagine sort of just going past him, coming in and them selling you a sort of cream cake tea. That is certainly in my mind. And you wonder then, I was shuffling around the pictures and I thought, now, yeah, because he's a friend of Toyo Ito, they're very close buddies, different though their architecture is. And then you think maybe Ito's had a few late night conversations with Fujimori and says, you know, you could do this with stuff and you could do that with stuff and weaving, and you know, this gets quite weavy in terms of Ito's herb. It just crossed my mind. I just thought I'd throw that out, and neither of them are sitting here, so we can't check it. And maybe you wouldn't admit it, but I have a funny little hunch that they might. This didn't, you know, Ito's a very, very smart cookie, and it might have come out of a funny conversation about wrapping and weaving and trees and tentacles and stuff. Only occurred to me this week. I'm probably barking up the wrong one. All this, which reminds me of provincial England, though you never get anything sticking out quite like that, or some sort of Nordic bell tower or something. But you see, the guy has been looking at arts and crafts. He admits to having been round looking at the English arts and crafts, and you do wonder. And then it makes the stuff in Paris with the vegetation look very sort of business as usual, because it just sits in between the windows. All right, nice, well done. But it's only saying, well, instead of having concrete panels, we've got veg. Cross out concrete panel, cross out brick panel, tick in veg. There we go, guys. Why not? Veg is an optional option. It would be interesting if not the building centre does much these days, but if if you went round to the building centre and, you know, in between all the sort of tiles, there was a sort of vegetation number 3. Quite reasonable now. We have the technology to do it, and we're doing it. Jeffrey Bauer, of course, lets the vegetation take into the architecture. That, I think, becomes then quite an interesting condition where the openness, the evacuation of the architecture, the stuff of the architecture is held back, and the vegetation then has not just an applique quality, but it actually has the beginnings of an organic quality, and in fact some of it's growing out of the roof. You begin to then speculate in your mind, how far could that go if you allowed for the vegetation and its roots and its trunks and so on to grow? Could there be a kind of structural system that could adapt to that? I mean, one's brain starts to seize up, but intrinsically it might be possible. Very difficult. And you start looking at various bits of natural vegetational form. You say, hey, wait a minute, digitalize that, guys, because some of you do. There's a fine line, almost non-existent fine line now, between the veg and the inventive potential of the computer with a smart person handling it. I think that therefore, just to go sideways a bit, the Belgian pavilion at the last Venice Biennale was also conscious about stuff. It took this prefabricated aluminium, I think it's aluminium system, maybe it was, I think it's aluminium, this prefabricated system and its ubiquitousness. And it took the ubiquitousness of confetti and said, that's it. I'm making officially another statement, but I think it's very knowing use of two lots of stuffs that one we would like to use, but it's associated with cheap building. The other, which you'd never think of, is in an architectural context, i.e. confetti. But you put the two together and you get an extremely at a few beautifully placed pieces of plantation. And you get an extreme condition of stuff. Or you wind round. And this is a theatre, I think in Denmark, by Jacobsen, of striated stuff. Or one speculates whether Liebeskin's Berlin Museum would have been different if it had not been surfaced in this paneling. It's always a moot point with Liebeskin stuff, because it does depend fantastically upon the linear patterning. The cut line, the actual cut, or the planted cut line. But you could imagine this done in stucco. You could imagine it done in brick. You could imagine it done in timber. Happens to have been done in metal panels. Whereas I suspect here, at the time of, I think it was about 1908 or thereabouts, Otto Wagner with the Post Office Savings Bank was making a very, very heroic gesture about glass. Not only do we have a glass floor, but we have a extremely considered glass sheathing. Underneath what is, if you look at the section drawings, there's a normal lantern light. There's a normal, pitch roof lantern in glass. But the magical glass line is the suspended one. And then the magical situation is all that light is coming through all of that glass and going through into the basement. That sort of thing, I think, is still heroic. Oh, just in passing in Helsinki, a sort of nothing architecture. No stuff, but it's almost so, it's almost a toy. Again, it had a snow top on it, but there's bad photo anyhow, but there's almost no detail. There's almost no, it's just pink. Could be pink icing, pink concrete, pink stone, pink Photoshop, could be anything really. It's just a little pink thing. there is a certain point at which you say, is that useful to discuss as architecture? Or just as I was saying earlier, that you sometimes have to go up into the woods and find some really spooky, extreme condition, or you have to take a plane to Buenos Aires and find it some extremely brilliant situation. Sometimes you just see some bloody thing, you know, and you say, hey, you know, I mean, I probably find it difficult to lecture about this waste bin, but, you know, on a good day I might try. Things like that amuse me because everything is taken away. Has no elegance, no presence of the object. It's a toy. I would have enjoyed it when I was 4. I'm now in my 70s. I'm still enjoying it, and there it is. But what is the gap between that and this? This is bigger. This is Oscar Niemeyer. This is something that's on the cover of a book, and it's special. But in certain ways, hasn't gone that much further. Or you go to Gottfried Semper in Vienna, who's done some wonderful buildings. I mean, we talk more about Wagner, but in fact Semper was no slouch. And here, my God, he's enjoying himself. Oh, God, he's like somebody who's sort of had, you know, the sherry trifle and Knickerbocker glory, and has asked for the sort of chocolate extras. It's extraordinary stuff. I keep using this word. When is it going to stop, we say? When is it going to stop, Gotti? You know, it's you've got to laugh. You've got to enjoy it. You know, I mean, one couldn't ever bring oneself to do it. Well, wait and see. But it, and I suppose, you know, to my sort of English tastes, it lost the baby with the bathwater somewhere. You know, somewhere there's some architecture there if you can only get rid of all this thing. But maybe that's what it's about. And if you have diarrhea afterwards, well, it was at least a good evening. And then you see student work, again up the road rather than here, but it might begin to be here now, where stuff becomes a preoccupation. And quite skillful stuff, but certainly somebody who was not the shrinking violet. Even MVRDV on a certain day will start to pile in the alternatives and say, yes, it's not just a housing block on the side in Amsterdam. Let's have one of these, and one of these, and none of that, and one of this, and one of these, and one of these, and make a bit of a Toblerone out of it. And why not? And because we expected a Frank Gehry, particularly in a wine condition. We expect it. We don't expect it of MVRDV. I think the Gehry is amazing. It's just a lovely, stuffy thing, but it probably offends a lot of people. Or Bruce Goff, who offended lots and lots of people, but was actually quite in control of his buildings. And what I found extraordinary, I met his engineer once, and his buildings were very, very skillfully and cleverly engineered. I brought in something I photographed this morning because I am not an innocent in all this. I'm involved in stuff. God knows, I've eaten the Knickerbocker glory, and I, under pressure, will talk about that on a later occasion. I couldn't resist bringing something badly photographed that was, as you know, was just finished yesterday afternoon. But I want to finish on the question of how ultimately we can play with stuff. Here is the building that isn't, but it sort of is. It depends whether you want it to be. In amongst the foam in the lake, Dylan Scofidio played this marvelous cloud. Only to the boring person who is interested, how do you do it? How do you keep it up? And how much of the solid bits of the building, if that's what we call them, certainly the structured bits of the building, how much do you disclose? How much is it necessary in the sequence of time to make the cloud completely omnipresent and say, we've achieved the ultimate. We've got rid of the stuff has melted. It's floated away into a cloud. Or actually, it was there. It's a device. And so I've tried to do the whole round of whether you take a very serious attitude to surfaces and materials, whether you play silly buggers with them, whether you consciously know how far you can conceal, reveal, light, play the opposite game at night, offend or attend, how much you can take a material that will be really, really like the Lars Funk or something, so fulsome you can't ignore it. And I wanted to find, but couldn't, a picture of German U-boat pens. When I first went to Trondheim in Norway many years ago, there's this enormous thing by the water which is a German U-boat pen. And of course the Norwegians didn't have a very good time with the Germans, and they wanted after the war to take it away. In no way can they remove it. It is just so big and solid and total and concrete and massive and thick that they have to live with it probably for as long as Trondheim will ever be there. And that's an intriguing thing and makes you think about Buckminster Fuller in a roundabout way. Thank you.